introducing briefly me. I'll introduce myself a bit more fully in a moment, but I'm very, very grateful for having the opportunity to be part of your lecture series. I believe that I'm now the 14th person to have given a presentation. You can see me on your screen, but what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to go to a PowerPoint, and hopefully that should start appearing on your screen very, very soon. Earl, can you just let me know that you can see that, please?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very, very much. So thank you. So what I want to do is I want to give an overview really to the theme of cities, their development, and in a sense, the field of urban history. I want to begin with a reference, a paraphrase to Spiro Kostof, who was a professor at Berkeley, referencing his book, The City Shaped, which was published in the early 1990s. And basically what Kostof is saying is that cities are more than just buildings and spaces. He indicates that they're really about people. Cities are products of civilization. He says these are the places where we have our daily rituals that can be both mundane, boring, and extraordinary. Cities have incredible validity to who we are as people. He says that within them, the continuities of time and place are embedded. The city is the ultimate memorial of our struggles and glories. So I want to really, again, emphasize that as much as someone like myself who has a PhD in architecture is interested in the physical component of the urban environment, at the same time, we need to think about cities in a much, much broader sense. And this is why, again, heritage is really, really important, feeds into what our culture is and likewise what our identity is. So that's my starting point. And I want to move to, I suppose, this abstract of what I'm going to do today. So our world of the 21st century is to a great degree defined by large-sized cities. And the backdrop is actually an image of Sao Paulo, which is a place of about 20 million, I believe, metropolitan population of about 20 million, somewhat comparable to Manila, but an absolutely frightening place to visit, something like Blade Runner, experiencing Blade Runner at first hand if you go. So anyway, our world of the 21st century is defined by large cities, but what do we really know about the places in which we live? Likewise, when we tend to go on holiday, we often visit cities. And of course, where business, certainly globalized business occurs, is also within cities. So I want within my introduction, my short talk, to introduce some basic aspects about urban history. I mean, of course, today what I'm touching upon is an enormous topic. So I can't discuss everything or we'd be here for a great amount of time. And as I say, on that note, I do need to thank you because it is a public holiday in the Philippines, just as it is in Hong Kong at the moment. So thank you for giving up your time to listen. But how can understanding the urban past basically help us think about our cities and understand them better today? So again, just to briefly touch upon myself, I'm Ian Morley. I'm based in the Department of History at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And as Earl said, I'm understood as an urban historian, although I don't really call myself an urban historian. I'm more of a planning historian, which is a field in the Philippines that you don't really have. But planning history is a large field of historians, geographers, town planners, architects. We have art historians, sociologists, sometimes even legal historians in this academic community. And again, together we try to understand the processes that affect the form and the meaning of cities. My background is that I'm interested in the design of cities, particularly in the Philippines. You can see on the screen 2 examples of my books that I've published. And in particular, I'm interested in American colonialism and its impact on city design in the Philippines. Although you can tell by my accent that I'm not American, I'm English. And this causes a great deal of confusion within the Philippines, why someone who's English should be interested in the Philippines, but we can talk about that a little bit more maybe. So as I said, my research focuses on American influence in the Philippines with respect to the evolution of colonial city planning. And again, there's a couple of books that you can see. But it's maybe a question that you could rightly ask is to why would a historian be interested in cities, and in particular be interested in their appearance and plan? So to get straight to the point, to study historic built environments opens windows to discover, explore, and explain the cultural, social, political, and economic meanings that are encoded in human habitats. and that were formed and developed in the past. The character of historic built fabrics not only reflects the influence of political agencies, but it also displays people's social and economic concerns, which in turn affected their behavior and social action. So as such, embedded in city design is a living history of political, economic, social, and cultural meanings and intentions. But of course, to understand cities is by no means straightforward, because it is said that cities are the most complex of all human inventions. So on your screen, you can see an image, a very kind of common image of Hong Kong, which is where I live and work. And this is a city that is well known throughout the world, and in a sense is a city that typifies Asia's modernity and the continent's place within the world economic system. In fact, I live in Hong Kong, that brands itself as Asia's world city. But as I often say to my students, what do you really know about Hong Kong in terms of its urban environmental history? More broadly opening the question, and now getting you to think generally, what do you know about cities of the world today? And importantly, what do you know about how cities of the world today and how they impact upon you in terms upon the way of which you live? And of course, at the same time, let's think of this question somewhat differently, and that is to say within a national frame. You can see on the screen an image of Manila, and my question to you would be, what do you really know of Manila as a person that comes from Philippine society? Question, therefore, for me to ask to you would be, how in Manila's past has it directly interacted in the development of your civilization? And in turn, how has it directly affected your society's evolution? It's a massive question. These are massive questions. But of course, without knowing this, you're therefore at a loss to understand why today 36% of the Philippine national economy is based within this city. So there's great, again, knowledge needed to be able to understand the past and how that, again, affects what we are as people and the environments in which we live today. Of course, likewise, cities are both central to our formation of identity. Events of both local, regional, and national importance have occurred within them. And these in turn have affected the narrative of how people today label themselves of, for instance, being of Bicol, or more broadly, being Filipino. But again, once more, what do you really know of Naga's urban past? How was it formed? Why was it shaped in the way that it was? How subsequently has this affected its narrative? And of course, these are important yet basic questions. And of course, to know Naga in this sense means to have familiarity with arguably the greatest urban planning document in urban history, and that is Spain's Imperial Law of the Indies. Knowing the urban past in terms of depth of factual knowledge, an explanation as to how and why it has come about in the form that it has, and with the meaning it has, clearly has massive implications for built heritage policy, and so environmental preservation or not. Our world today, of course, consists of local cultures, national cultures that sit alongside a global culture and economy that is more or less grounded in large-sized cities. More than 4 billion people presently live in urban places. And the statistics from the United Nations reveal that the 10 biggest cities have a combined population of more than 230 million people, which is about the size of Brazil. But again, to repeat what I've said earlier, what do we really know about cities as people in the early 21st century? And so by association, what do we know of their history? After all, it's easy for us in our highly modern, technologically driven and globalized world to think that our cities have little or nothing in common with the urban world of the past. Images like this kind of reinforce this. There's nothing historical apparently here. But if we think in this kind of way, then we're really being factually wrong. Cities during the past few thousand years have played a vital role in developing civilization. It's important to think of the evolution of particular civilizations in the past without thinking of their cities. Cities in every historical era and in every geographical context have not just been engines of economic expansion, they've also been centers of cultural growth, social progress, and political change. And I'm just briefly sidestepping to mention John Reeder in the book Cities. And again, Reeder basically says that, in the 6,000+ years that cities have existed, he says that there are striking similarities that exist. And again, this is something that's very hard for us in our modern way of thinking to sometimes grasp. He says the only difference between cities of the past and cities of the world today is the way that people have utilized technology to make life easier. So my point here is that towns and cities of the past and today contain commonalities. And I'd like to just briefly raise 4 basic points in this regard. The first point is that they are sites of decision-making. It is within them that we have found and still find public and private institutions and organizations that shape political and economic power, for example. The second point is that irrespective of their size, their density, population size, cities provide people with opportunities to escape the rigidities of traditional rural society and to participate in a variety of lifestyles and behaviors. At the same time, cities are places where things get done. Cities provide environments for organizing labor, capital, and materials. They are places where physical infrastructure is found so that necessary services to the efficient running of society can occur. And then my fourth and final broad point is the concentration of people within cities makes for human interaction and competition. And this in turn promotes innovation and the exchange of knowledge and innovation. And I think this is really important because the exchange of knowledge and innovation is often provoked at times of disaster. And of course, we're living in a time of tragedy at the moment with the presence and impact of COVID-19. I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the very end of my talk. But it's no coincidence, therefore, that if we spend time to think about who we are and our futures, we see it within an urban context. We see it in terms of where our work will be. And if you're a student, you'll often see it in terms of where universities will be based. Because as we know, as an outcome of our life experiences, it is within cities where universities, museums, sports stadia, palaces, transport links, and an array of cultural facilities can be found. We know as well, thanks to our accumulated knowledge, that if we want to go into business, we basically will be dealing directly with people who are also based in an urban setting. It's highly likely that our workforce will be born and raised within a town and the city if we were to create our own business. And if we're looking for customers, it's highly likely they'll be urban based if we're looking at potential markets for us to exploit. So cities, as I'm generically indicating, should not just be understood solely as the locations or concentrations of sometimes very, very large numbers of people. They need to be understood as being the sites where human endeavor occurs, and in the past, obviously has occurred. However, we cannot ignore the vast numbers of people that presently live within our cities. And the question to ask is why? Well, again, let's step back a little bit in time in order to think about this question. Now, in 1800, in other words, in about 200 or so years ago, when the world's first industrial revolution was gathering pace in England, less than 5% of the world's population lived in town. Places and under different cultures was firmly fixed to rural locations. But in the 19th and 20th century, a major cultural change occurred. People living in all the world's continents moved from the countryside into towns and cities. Consequently, by the early years of this century, for the first time in human history, we live in a world that is predominantly urban. The majority of people now live in towns and cities rather than in the countryside. So for me, as a historian, I'm interested to know, how did we get to this point of human evolution? In other words, how in the past did people establish the building blocks that helped to create the modern world that we live in today? As someone interested in urban history, knowing the influence of cities upon this process is really fundamental to my being as an academic. You see, the common mistake people think about studying history is that to know the past has no relevance or value. You often hear, what consequence, for instance, or importance does learning about the ancient Greeks or Romans have to understanding our world today? Well, when people say that, they're greatly missing the point, because in a sense, they don't understand what history as a subject is. History is about investigating and understanding the past, but the fundamental reason why historians do this is in order to know how the present has come into being. To keep things simple, history is a means to generate time link. The knowledge developed from its study allows you and I to link past to present, and then by knowing what the present is, to be able to see the potential direction of society in the future. So what does this mean when we're considering the topic of cities and their development? How can learning the urban past let us better understand the urban present, and therefore possibly the urban future too? So let me briefly highlight 3 things for you to consider in this regard. Point number one, in Western civilization, when we think about the foundation and growth of cities, then in many ways it's impossible to ignore the ancient Greeks. Their legacy is not only evident in the establishment of cities across Europe, or the creation of types of architecture, but also from their innovations in terms of what civil society should be. The Greeks introduced to us the concept and practice of urban well-being. In other words, happiness should be a right for everybody. Of course, not just when we think of well-being today, we think of it in two ways, in terms of our bodily health, but also our mental health. And of course, at the same time, the Greeks introduced to the world the idea and practice of urban-centered democracy. Likewise, the ancient Romans took forward the Greeks' notion of administration and governance, which they evolved in the frame of their empire, with its countless urban centers, its road and water infrastructures, and through the growth of local, regional, and continental trading routes. This is why if you travel to Europe, it's possible to find heritage in the form of Roman roads, as well as Roman city walls, aqueducts, colosseums, baths, temples, and public buildings. And of course, up to the evolution of modern architecture post-World War II, essentially Western architectural models were based on ancient Greek and Roman forms. But again, to go back to the ancient Romans, central to the existence of Roman civilization was city design, was urban design. The layout and appearance of urban places, be they large or small, were part of an environmental and political system administered from Rome that sought to show off imperial power. Yet the role of power and influence of power upon cities has by no means been unique to the Romans. The expressing of power has been a major factor shaping how our cities have been formed and then developed, because at different times and in different regions of the world, the likes of Beijing, Istanbul, Kyoto, London, Moscow, Mexico City, Paris, and Vienna have become expressions of grandeur and imperial power in brick and stone. My central point number two is that the rise of industrial economies redesigned cities and created a new kind of urban place, that is the industrial city. And Manchester was the first of this new breed of urban place. It being a city whose basic existence was not to fulfill a military or religious function, but in contrast to acquire raw materials and assemble, manufacture, and distribute goods. Industrial economies were unlike earlier types of economies. They had to be organized with large volumes of labor. They required transportation networks, and their development led to a range of new building types, for example, warehouses and factories. Significantly, too, industrial cities brought new social, cultural, and environmental dynamics to the fore. New social structures, new levels of poverty, inequality, pollution, and segregation existed within them. So whilst thanks to the rise of manufacturing industry, a nation can gather great wealth and also take on possible influence outside of its political borders, in contrast, the fast unplanned growth of industrial cities led to new instances of disease and in relation, premature death. The medical historian, who I believe is based at Oxford University, Simon Schreiter, he talks about this in terms of 4Ds. He talks about it in terms of disruption, dirt, disease, and death, in a sense they being fundamentals of the industrial city's being. London, as a brief example, was the richest and largest city of the 19th century, yet had a life expectancy in its slums of less than 20 years. To be poor in London meant the daily risk of dying young, and in parts of the city in the mid-1800s, the poor lived 29 years less on average than the rich members who tended to live in the west of the city. Therefore, such consequences, together with new ideas for social reform, led to the rise of city planning as a facet of state intervention, so as to establish betterment in society. And I think, again, in this point, in order to have urban planning, you need two basic conditions, or two basic conditions must be met. The first is that as a matter of course, attention must be given to the idea of arranging and laying out cities. And then secondly, you need town builders, city builders, that is to say, persons with the ability to care for the well-being of the population. But of course, we need to understand that their ability varies by time and also through civilization. So urban planning, which we consider in many cases as quite a new phenomenon, actually isn't. Again, to understand its development, we have to go back in time, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But of course, under the forces of industrial revolutions, new ideas as to town design evidently were required. In this regard, Paris was a model for cities across the world to follow. Paris's redevelopment under Georges Haussmann in the mid-1800s allowed it to redefine itself not just in economic, political, and technological terms. Paris's environmental renewal from a medieval to modern city allowed it to take on a status that as a work of art, that it was a work of art, and this reputation clearly still endures. Indeed, when we think of a beautiful city, Paris is still the epitome for most of us. Its buildings, its streets represent a pride and spirit of human aspiration and achievement. And as an exemplar of urban design, the splendor and grandeur of the French capital was explicitly impacting at the end of the 19th century in the United States. The renewal of the American capital city, Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the last century was inspired by changes in Paris. And because of American imperialism in Southeast Asia after the Spanish-American War of 1898, new ideas to lay out cities were introduced in the Philippines, for example, in Manila, but also in other places, Baguio being, of course, another obvious example. But my third and final key point I wish to introduce to you today is associated with the rise, the role, and importance of globalization to city development and the character of contemporary urban place. The term globalization for most of us refers to the evolution of the late 20th century economic system that in terms of cities resulted in an international urban system. The cities of the international urban system, global cities as they're commonly referred to, are broadly acknowledged to possess key roles in relation to banking and finance, corporate organization, and the world of international agencies. Global cities to a large degree are the hubs of flows of information, the places of present-day innovation, the sites of financial transaction that sustain transcontinental economies and cultural expansion. Accordingly, they provide an interface between the local and the international. They operate as the place for economic, cultural, and institutional apparatus to channel the resources of the global economy back into a nation's provincial centers. But of course, in actuality, globalization is not a 20th century phenomenon. It has a much longer existence. From the late 1500s, that is to say about 400 years ago, before the term globalization was coined and widely taken up, the city of Manila stood at the heart of a trading system that linked the Americas, Africa, Europe, and different regions of Asia together. The commodity fueling the creation and maintenance of this international trading system was silver, imported into the Philippines from Peru via Mexico, and then purchased by the Ming Chinese to sustain the dynasty's need for silver coins. Hence, with new awareness of urban history phenomena, we understand that just as our world becomes acknowledged through different lenses, in fact, we can begin to understand it in truth through more accurate frames as well. So to bring things towards a conclusion, our cities today are far from perfect, yet we take the places of human habitation, our places of habitat, for granted. So therefore, by seeking to grasp more insight into the urban past, by means, for instance, of recognizing how urban systems developed, how cultures emerged and grew, how places assumed distinct characteristics, given the local, national, and sometimes global forces that operate within them, it permits us to acquire a wisdom that is not only relevant for advanced education in schools and societies, but a knowledge that is relevant for us as citizens of a society. After all, history shows us that humans have shaped cities, but we also need to acknowledge that cities have shaped us. At the same time, thinking about the history of the urban grants new occasion to ascertain how people in towns and cities have interacted with the natural world, and how this engagement at times has produced challenges to our customs, our norms, and our values. Appraising the association between cities and the world at large is, of course, especially timely given the present-day reality of a disease affecting the well-being of billions of people in countless countries. Without stating the obvious, it has been in cities where the impact of COVID-19 has been most profoundly felt. And so, reconsidering an earlier point about the past and present links, how do cities shape disease? And how do disease shape cities? It's obvious. The past informs us that the social, cultural, and economic influence of epidemics has affected humankind in the past, and that the need to fight disease and the need to make policy is mutually enriched through engagement with culture. Urban history thus allows us to better understand our surroundings, for better or for worse at times. It lets us know, amongst other things, that disease reveals and exacerbates social and economic fractures, tensions, and injustices that lie within our societies. It reminds us of the prevalence and importance of germs, for instance, in the urban setting, that innovation in terms of disease management is often provoked by tragedy and fear, and that typically disease only becomes part of the public conversation once disaster occurs. At this point, evidently, epidemiology, which we rely on to save lives, becomes a reactive, not proactive tool. Doctors, administrators, etc., have to work back in time to find the sources and proliferation of illness. Hence, society needs science, yet science needs also society. In turn, society needs history, and we should realize that history needs us. So again, what I want to think of is, again, this relationship between society and science, science and society. Let's think of this in terms of one of the great scientific contributions in history. This is my final point, and that is the development of vaccines. Only with vaccines, ultimately, do epidemics become banished to the past. Vaccines not only protect the individual, but we also need to understand that they also help to make the environments in which we live, work, and play become clean for everybody. Thank you very, very much for your time and for your attention on this public holiday morning. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Wait. Thank you, Dr. Ian Marley, for that very wonderful lecture. For sharing about urban histories and cities this morning. So now I'm opening the virtual floor for our Q&A segment. But let me, okay. Yeah. So there's a question from Dr. Acabado. Okay, I'll just read it. I'll just read the question, sir.
Okay.
It's quite long. Okay, so it's on the chat box. So while I'm reading the question, and you can now ask you can type, for our participants and panelists, you can freely ask your questions. So let me start with Dr. Acabado's question. So in Southeast Asia, early modern history settlement pattern is characterized as high density. That is low population. That is lower populations but more settlements. But dispersed. However, as a consequence of the maritime trade, the ASEAN and European trade, this changed into a low density settlement pattern. So which is high population densities in cities but less settlements. So this shift has stressed the environment, resource extraction, waste management, diseases, etc., and has shaped out world today. So the question is, how do you think, as a planning historian, Southeast Asian communities can address um, this looming or continuing disaster? So as Tony Reid argued, this has started in the 17th century, initiated by trade and a massive population decline in Southeast Asian urban cities areas.
Okay. Well, I'm not so familiar with Tony Reid's argument, but I don't necessarily agree that from the 17th century there's been a population decline in urban areas. It's quite the opposite. And I don't agree necessarily with the statement. Sorry, I'm just going back to the statement that was put on the chat that, okay, lower populations, more settlements, and then the concentration, but I don't agree that it's necessarily low density. Cities maintain high density, but of course of larger size. But again, that's the thing that's very interesting to understand about prior to modernization's impact in Southeast Asia, cities were still very, very small. I mean, if you take the history of Manila as an example, even at the beginning of the last century, it was only about 200, and I think the first American census puts it at 225,000 people. So by context, in comparison to places in other countries, it was actually very, very small, certainly in terms of Europe or North America. I think the issue has been, the issue really, yes, clearly there's matters of economics, but the great issue is politics. What is political motivation and the role of planning in the national development setting? I'm not going to be an apologist for colonization at all, but if we look at the history of planning in the Philippines, it's colonial. If you come to the much more contemporary context, and I don't mean this in a flippant way, when you come to see urban planning in the Philippines today, it's usually in regard to private housing areas, usually very high status, or shopping centers, shopping malls. Looming disaster. I mean, again, you know, there's enough knowledge now with regards to issues of sustainability and resilience to understand how cities work. The issue is, it's very, very hard to create a perfect city. Still today, there is no such thing as a perfect city. I'm recognized, for instance, New Clark City, which is being developed, is being modeled on ideas within Philippine society as to what resilient, smart, sustainable cities should be. And that offers a new paradigm. But the thing again about planning in that kind of monumental setting, it takes a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time. So it's a very, very rare example. If we look through history, usually when it comes to creating new cities, these are often new capitals because again, there's a political motive. So planning on a large scale like that, it's a question that in a sense is unanswerable. Of course, the simple answer is history gives empirical, empirical, it gives experience that can be used as directives. But at the end of the day, what civilization is, how people engage with the city. Continuing disaster, I like that, maybe. Continuing problems. It's affected by so many things affect cities, not just the natural environment, but as I've said, political context, economic context, cultural issues. I mean, the thing again for the Philippines is you are an urbanizing society and you're a very, very fast growing society. You have a very young population. By 2050, your population is going to be 150 million. Now, to compare that with the first American census of 1903, you were 7.6 million people at that point in time. So it's a near what 2,000% population increase would be in 150 years. That places incredible strains on cities, regardless of whether you have planning or not. So I think the context is that, well, again, if you shift to low density, it doesn't necessarily mean that you create better cities. If you're creating low density cities, you need to have transport links so that people can get from home to work. Philippines generally is not a city. You don't have a city history where there's a lot of emphasis on transportation planning. And when transportation planning has occurred, it's been very, very reactive. I mean, Manila, when people talk about transportation planning there, I mean, it's a non-starter for me. And it's a case of, again, I think what the question is, have opportunities in the past been lost? And how maybe re-referencing those can guide us so that we don't repeat the mistakes in the future. That might be a way of thinking about the question that Dr. Abacado is presenting. But I think that the notion of low density cities, well, I mean, this is the model that's been applied in terms of suburbanization in the West, and there's now a reaction against that. We're now finding that mixed use, not high density, but higher density than what currently exists, form of planning is the way of the future. For instance, in England, city planning in Barcelona is considered very important. It's a very important model because you have apartment buildings, but you have the notion of urban space. And again, urban space, particularly green space, is considered very, very important to people's well-being. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't wish to kind of dodge the bullet of that very difficult question, Dr. Abacado, but it's a really, really big question to ask. And I think that's a PhD thesis in itself, to be quite honest.
Okay. There's a message from Dr. Cabado.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm seeing those on the screen. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the Philippines is, of course, the political context is so important. You know, the issue of motivation and money, the ability to ensure that policy works in the way that it's designed, that corruption ideally should not exist. Because, you know, urban development, like in China, really is about opportunism, like it had been in 19th century Britain. You know, people in 19th century Britain who built houses weren't builders. They were often financiers who just got a few people together and knocked on average 5 houses together. In the 19th century, the average house builder, building property developers built 5 houses. This is about opportunism. Urban development provides opportunity for money. So, you know, again, how can that be controlled politically and legally is very important. So the application of law, the creation of planning law, in terms of building new paradigms into legal frames is very, very important. So in Britain in the 19th century, we, as a reaction against the Industrial Revolution and because of the influence of public health, promoted the idea that disease came from miasma, so light, air, and space, with the 3 basic structural forms that were built into urban environments. But that only the regulations only were applicable to new houses in order to ensure that people's property rights were maintained. And the only way that law could negate private property rights if the house was then defined in about 20 years down the line by the 1860s as a slum. That's when we created slum legislation, slum clearing legislation. And a slum was, again, defined essentially on a definition created by doctors. A slum was a house unfit for human habitation. It was a house that put your health at risk. And essentially the threat of law was to the landlord, that if you keep your house in a relatively decent state, habitable state, then the state cannot touch you. The law cannot touch you. But if you simply neglect the structural form of your property and it becomes dangerous for people to live, then the threat is that it can be removed. But even then, you know, slum clearing is a very, very costly endeavor. And if we think about, say, the Philippines, and again, just as an obvious example, Manila, if you were to clear the slums, where do you put the people? You know, there's millions of people living below the poverty line, living in whatever property in inverted commas they can find. So you can't, it's not just a case of knocking things down and starting again. It's not just as easy as that. Do you have displacement laws in the Philippines? Do you have rehousing laws? If you don't have them, then slum clearing on a mass scale is an absolute non-starter. Even if you move people, again, the example from history is that slum dwellers, even if you knock down their housing, they will try to live as near to as where they can previously. And the reason for this is because they need to live near sources of employment. So again, we come back to the economic matter. So it's not just one thing, it ties into so many facets of how civilization evolves. It's a very, very complicated thing. And again, there's really no excuse today to not know about resilience or sustainability, smart cities. That information can be found so easily through the internet. You know, Dr. Peterson, he can tell you more about, you know, heritage. It's very, very easy through online means to access different case studies of how heritage works successfully and unsuccessfully in some instances. So again, we have the luxury of access to information through technology. We have access to potentially different means of transportation because of technology. But again, whether they get applied, how they get applied, by whom they get applied, this is a very, very, again, serious questions that politicians and obviously lawyers have to work through themselves.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ian. Are there any questions or insights from our panelists or from our attendees, participants? Okay.
Do you mind if I just say a general question, a general point?
Yes.
One of the things about the Philippines is that, you know, you have this incredible history, and history, you know, modern history in a sense is so political. It's so post-colonial history is so politicized, particularly when you look at history from the 1960s. through to the 80s and even beyond that. But the thing about cities is that there's no real urban history fraternity. Urban history in the West, I mean, urban history as a distinct academic field really comes from Scandinavia more than 100 years ago, where the people in the different Scandinavian nations were interested in their sense of nationhood. What made them distinct in one area from people in a different part of Scandinavia, and how did cities feed into that process? In Britain, urban history became a distinct field in the 60s and 70s. And of course, it operates a little bit differently from the US, where there's a great emphasis on social history, particularly matters of race and community development. But in the Philippines, really, urban history is only studied through the prism of local history. There's no urban history organization. There's no community. There's off the top of my head, there's only about 2 or 3 people that I would call urban historians in terms of their approach. Everything else is very kind of local history. That's not to say people don't deal with aspects of local history, but it comes through a very different intellectual lens. And of course, this is really, really important because historians, a lot of heritage is, again, particularly in Manila, in a sense, hijacked by architects. And it's seen in this very, very structuralized form about buildings. But when you ask them questions about, okay, so why is that building important, other than it has maybe a particular window shape or something? How, in other words, is that building an important representer of that society from the time that it was built? There's often no answer that comes forward, because history as a field doesn't feed into heritage. So it drives me mad when I'm on these Facebook groups and I see people posting things about urban development and city history from the past, and the facts are wrong. The facts are, but they're accepted. The things what they're saying are accepted as truthful, and that's what someone like Danny will tell you, that good historical study is thorough investigation to be as truthful as you can. The importance of truth, the truth, not a truth, the truth. It's absolutely paramount to the way history works, and that needs to feed in to the broader heritage discourse, urban heritage discourse, to explain why spaces or why buildings are important markers of civilization at certain times in that evolutionary narrative. And again, therefore, through museums, how the public can be informed, or through other programs, how the public can be informed, because that's the fundamental problem, that heritage, that essentially it's an elite concept and an elite practice. And that's the very, very important thing. You put so much emphasis in education about learning about your national heroes and what it is to be Filipino. But then that needs to be translated into protecting it, maintaining it. You can protect it through having arguments online about China and the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, about the geopolitical situation. But you've got to think about that at home. You've got to think about that at home within where you live. And that's a really, really important question that hasn't been answered. I mean, there's people answering it, but in the broadest sense, it's a really, really important question, because the issue needs to be taken out of the hands of architects. There needs to be much more balance. It's either about tourism, legal people, or architects, heritage broadly in the Philippines. And there's a great need for other people to play a role in discourse. And the historians really need to come forward. There's a space for urban historians, young urban historians, to come through and really become specialists in this regard, to have an inside perspective, but at the same time an awareness from outside, so they can blend this all together and really, really reframe and take heritage forward, so that urban development isn't just a precursor to knock everything down that's old. Because we often think that heritage is basically to many politicians, it's a pain in the arse. Heritage is a pain in the arse because it stops property development. And that's not how it should be seen. It needs to be understood in a much, much bigger cultural setting, because when it's gone, it's gone. And that's the important thing. And that's what China shows. You end up with these kind of pastiche things in the big cities that represent heritage, but that's the reality. The past is almost gone. So the preservation, the maintenance, and the importance of the past is really, really important, not just in our intellectual communities, but in terms of, again, connecting with society at large.
Okay. Okay? There's a question from Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment. Thank you for the question about heritage and cities and pandemics. And one of the big issues is for me, we don't know when this is going to end. That's the first question. But again, we can see through examples from the past, what we might call contagious cities, that there's been practices that have been implemented in order to kind of drive forward or re-guide urban development. Do I think there will be political, social tools for heritage preservation? It's hard not to be pessimistic, because I think we live in so many countries. The political focus at the moment is about restarting economies and getting people back to work. And all we hear in the news at the moment is how much economies are shrinking at the moment, how many people have lost jobs. And again, it's a very sad reality, but I would like to be optimistic to believe that there is tools. I know at the Chinese university that I've got colleagues who are creating, it's not so much about heritage, but thinking about the city as non-space. How do we engage with cities when we can't use them? Like when we're locked down? How does that impact not just our well-being, but our engagement with economies, or in terms of just our day-to-day way of living? So that again, heritage should be part of should in theory be part of these kind of frames. But unfortunately, I've had to kind of remind these people, by the way, I'm a historian. If you want a slightly more historical understanding than something that just is a contemporary problem, please let me know. But again, the kind of geographers and architects are so kind of driven in this contemporary and forward-thinking frame about what do we do tomorrow, that often history and heritage gets left on the back burner. So I'd like to be optimistic that there should be, but whether it does or not, I think that's, again, I think politicians are not going to do much difference other than restart economies.
Okay. Are there any more questions from our panel or attendees? Okay. So I have a question. Maybe I just like to some points were already answered, but I'd like um, to clarify some points, because um, in this 21st century, there are studies that we are moving into cities, like because of smart cities. So like smart cities where people has easy access to home and work and other stuffs that we need. So it brings more people to live on the cities. That makes our cities more dense. So I've 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 seen one of your points that this density also causes diseases and something like that. So should we rethink that this trend of doing smart cities into a more like we go back to our provinces or rural areas that
But smart cities are about limited populations. It's about controlling population sizes. And again, this is not a unique idea. If we think about garden cities, the garden city idea, which was put forward in the very end of the 19th century as a reform idea in the UK, and became very, very influential in as far afield as Japan, countries such as also in America by the 1920s, influence on people like Clarence Stein. Look, the garden city was about you create an urban unit, and when it reaches a certain size, you then create the next one. But it's surrounded by countryside, the idea of the green belt, so that urban sprawl is restricted. And the idea of green belt as well is not just preservation of green space, but it allows for self-sustainability, because it allows the local community to farm its land, to produce its own food. I mean, this is again one of the big issues. There's a very interesting book by Daniel Dopers called Feeding Manila. And one of the big changes about the Philippines was you used to be this exporting nation. You used to be able to farm with a much more small population that you had, farm and export a lot of products. And now you essentially have to import. And again, that's a really, really profound change that has to be looked at in the future. Of course, the thing about, again, you know, low density, the point is, if you want a house and a big garden, you can't then be close to a city center. In other words, the place where you work, or the place where you go shopping, the place where you go to the theater or museum, where your museum is found. You can't have both. That's the problem in places like Australia, many parts of America. People want to be able to access downtown. They want to live near it, but they don't, you know, they want a big house and a garden. Well, you can't necessarily have both. So the notion, again, you can have higher density, not high density, higher density than what would be traditional. But at the same time, you can still maintain social space, a green space. This is the big, again, fallacy, the big problem people don't understand of architects like Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse, which was his plan in the 1930s for Paris, which includes these high-rise houses of 50 to 60 stories. The idea of high-rise housing was to make the city become a park. This, in a sense, you take away the traditional idea of the street, and each floor level becomes a street that allows for social interaction. These ideas have been completely lost, completely diluted by architects into something like what you have in the Philippines today, which is neither anything. So there are, again, important models, but the way that those models have been taken and then transformed and, excuse my language, bastardized, basically, they're completely 180% in a different direction to what they were intended to do. Le Corbusier's idea of high density living was to ensure 90% of the city was green space. The city is a park. That would be great. I'd love that in Hong Kong. I don't mind. I live on the 31st floor. I don't mind living high. You get a nice view. But if that meant living high was meaning I could have green space, brilliant. I think they should do that in England. Although we like houses and gardens. That's the traditional way we live. But yeah, I don't have a problem with living in relative density. The problem is if you have unplanned density, that's when you get traffic problems. That's when you get issues of disease. And again, historically, when you have unplanned cities, fast unplanned cities, growing at high densities, that's when disease becomes the problem. And as we know, epidemiology is reactive to disease. You have to find where the disease source is. You have to then trace the people who've been connected, isolate them, et cetera, the same kind of process of care, investigation, and containment. Again, historically, has happened is what we essentially have today, albeit with more modern science and better hospitals. But as I said, you know, people have always lived with some kind of density. It's just the issue is the size and, in a sense, proximity of home and workplace. If you want to have lower density, then home and workplace become separated. That means you need a public transportation system, or alternatively, biking. Create bike lanes. I mean, these are completely absent in the Philippines. I think in New Clark City they're going to integrate this. In Hong Kong we have bike lanes, but there's some parts of the city which are not necessarily friendly for biking. Again, going back to Manila, it's like a death wish. To go cycling in Manila would be a death wish. I know there's been talks of creating cycle lanes along the waterfront, along the bay, but how would you access them? You know, if you live in Quezon City, are you going to cycle all the way to from Quezon City to Rosas Boulevard to go cycling? You'd be dead. you know, it's dangerous. So it's really, again, these are complex issues that need to be thought of and practiced. There's no reason why they can't be discussed, at the very least. As I said, there's enough knowledge to know this. Even again within heritage frames, if you take in Yangon Heritage Trust is about preserving downtown, linking downtown to the suburbs, and ensuring downtown that space and vista, view to important buildings, are preserved. That views to pre-colonial buildings, not just colonial buildings, but views to heritage, because it maintains the notion of what is unique about the city and what is unique as it as a product of a distinct civilization. These are again very important and embedded principles.
Okay, sir. Thank you, po. There's a question from Dr. Herona. Sir, should I just read your question, or do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah.
Hi, Danny.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Morley. Yeah. I would like thank you very much in the first place for
No, it's all right. No problem.
yeah, and congrats for the lecture.
Thank you.
Ayan, my question is, as we have gone through the records in the Spanish archives mainly, the apparent reasons why the upper consideration, I might say the uppermost considerations given by the Spaniards in building the towns and cities were actually mainly colonialists, and the purpose is to confine them for conversion and of course for colonial control. But how much did you see in the records as to the concern regarding the potentials of the place for economic development?
Well, I mean, you're the specialist on the Spanish era, and as you say, you know, the notion of urban development was in part to bring natives under the bells, you know, and as you say, for purposes of conversion, because you know, so much of Spanish colonization has this really fundamental promotion of evangelicalism, that it was morally acceptable by the Spanish to confine the natives because ultimately you're giving them salvation. You know, you're saving them from going to hell. That's one of the kind of moral justifications. I mean, the thing as well is that, you know, the Spanish, they developed the haciendas. So there's the farming connection, which of course is in many parts connected to the churches. Because that one of the big things about, certainly in early colonization, there were so few Spaniards that were there. So the church and the state have this very, very binary association. When you come to the American era, it takes on a slightly different sense of being. One of the things the Americans were very big upon was in part because it was their propaganda as modernizers, but the development of infrastructure. You know, they could build, the idea that, you know, the Spanish built roads of mud, occasionally of stone, but the Americans were bringing tarmac. Where the Spanish had built things with stone and brick, and the Americans could build with concrete. And things like port development. That was considered really important for local, for regional, in the case of, say, Cebu or Iloilo and Manila. The notion of development in terms of import, export, really the expansion of capitalism. And in part, as I said, propaganda was very important because the Americans wanted to show that they were doers, that the Spanish had been talkers, talked for 300 odd years about doing things, but in reality, the Philippines was still very archaic, very backward in a sense. So there's this kind of black legend propaganda that the Spanish were kind of nasty and oppressive and authoritarian, and the Americans were liberators in the fullest sense of the term, in terms of not just giving people new civil rights, but giving them new economic rights to earn money. And again, part of the American, if you look through to the 1920s and 30s, you get the broadening of the economic base in the Philippines and the rising of a new middle class, a new urban middle class, which is very important. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very big question what you're asking, Danny. And I'm not trying to dodge it, but you know, the colonial regimes operated within very, very different frameworks. And as you say, you know, when you come to look at certain things in the provinces, it's really a church history almost, first and foremost. That's not to say that the Spanish didn't come and farm, but you know, when we look again, I can't remember, sorry, the source, but there is a source that said, and I'm thinking of this in terms of the Manila Galleon. It's written about the Manila Galleon to say that, you know, it was not worthwhile for the Spanish unless they were really motivated to, in the 1600s, early 1700s, to really develop farming in central Luzon. That's not to say that they didn't, but by and large, you could be lazy, and as long as you invested in the galleon and it arrived, you could make enough money, you could survive that way. So, you know, the things that took place in, say, South America in terms of mining or farming endeavor, as a general picture, just didn't exist on the same scale. That's not to say that within certain regions things didn't happen, because, for instance, in the very, very south of the Philippines, sorry, I can't remember, is it Maui, near Mindanao? The British were trading indigo with the Muslim natives. And again, that was part of the British reason in the 1760s for coming to the Philippines. The British believed that there would be opportunity all over the Philippines for different economic interactions with the local people. And of course, when they attacked Manila in 1762 and then realized the reality, they kind of realized how stupid they'd been. They bought into the imagery that Manila was this grand emporium and the Philippines was a place of opportunity. And it was absolutely difficult for them in their very overstretched colonial infrastructure based in India at that time to really get things moving. So they kind of didn't lose face. But when they, in 1764, left, you know, in many respects, it gave them a nice, convenient choice, because they just found it was so difficult to try and get things moving that they thought there'd be much more infrastructure in order to develop economic things. You clearly know that, you know, in Bicol there was gold mining. There were attempts at things like that as well, other than just simply farming endeavor. But it was nothing comparable with what we would find in terms of, say, silver mining in Potosi, or, you know, or places like this in South America. It was a much more minimalized operation. And again, this is in part because we live in this world today where we're so globally connected. We have to realize how far the Philippines was as an adjunct of Nueva España. You know, it was a hell of a journey, a very, very dangerous, uncomfortable journey for months to get across the Pacific Ocean. And likewise, you know, the communication network through which bureaucracy operated, I believe it took about 18 months, a letter from Madrid to get to Manila. I mean, it was, you know, we live in an instantaneous world, and the world of then and the movement of people was so much slower than what we understand the world today. We can go anywhere in the world under normal circumstances on a plane. In those days, it was a massive life-changing decision to get on a boat. And of course, it was indeed life-threatening to then, in some instances, arrive in a foreign country, not speak the native language, because the natives didn't necessarily understand Spanish. They didn't learn it. There wasn't the formal education structures at that time. It's not to say people didn't have a familiarity with Spanish because of the catechisms that they were taught, but their general ability to learn Spanish was very, very limited. And of course, that meant that the pressure was on the Spaniard to be familiarized with native tongue, native culture, and then in the sense of exploit that for the purpose of using human capital to develop things such as farming. You're much more engaged with that question with regards to the 1600s. I'm a modern historian. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Ian, and thank you, Dr. Rana, for that question. There's another question from Dr. Acabado. Let me read the question, sir. There's a growing disaster studies scholars who are arguing for informed decisions that states and other government agencies should not force people to move out of potentially dangerous areas. So in a sense, this provides agency to marginalized people uh, who are mostly affected by catastrophes.
Mhm.
So again, there might not be a one size fits all answer to this. But I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts about um, this movement. You provide the information to communities, then you let them decide. So
Well,
does it,
there's a marginalization because the existence of those people that live most at risk to disaster are usually they're poor people. There's a relationship between risk of disaster and socioeconomic status. And again, those people are not going to move unless they feel that moving is going to give them better opportunity, better life opportunity. And that's again the importance of planning. You can't just simply say to someone, move your house. Well, where are they going to go? How are they going to survive? So with the best of intentions, saying, look, you live in somewhere that's at risk of typhoon. Okay, we know, for instance, there's studies now that on the east coast of the Philippines that there's potentially millions of people at risk living in low-lying areas or areas that are prone to Typhoon Haiyan, as it was, that went through Leyte and, Tacloban a few years ago. There's a very high risk that that could occur again. But again, those people, it's like, this is the thing, slum dwellers historically don't move. They're there for a reason. People live where they are for a reason because they cannot move. One of the reasons is that's where their economic activities take place. They are fixed into that locality. So unless you move all their resources, if you want to call it that, economic, etc., to somewhere else, they won't want to move. It's quite simple. That's why what happens when you have slum clearing, people often move back towards the area where it was cleared, where the land was cleared. It seems crazy, but that's because people need to live near where they have access to economic opportunity. So again, unless that matter is addressed, then, and of course, do you have legal mechanisms to force people? Can you forcefully move people? That's the other choice. Okay. During the lockdown, you are, in a sense, legally compelled to stay within your house and only come out at certain times. It's regulated. If you go out at other times, you run the risk of getting arrested. Okay, having a financial penalty. You can take the risk if you wish, but you know that there's, again, a framework here. So do you have that law in the Philippines? If you do, well, again, do you have rehousing law? The thing again, it seems to be very pessimistic. If you look at the money that was pumped into Tacloban, and now even a few years later, the lack of people that have been rehoused, it were put into new housing. It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling, the inefficiency, the corruption that's occurred. So again, these are big problems that have to be addressed. It's not quite as simple as saying to someone, you live in a dangerous area, you need to move. And again, when people are told that, they often will say, okay, if you can find me somewhere better, great. But again, what is better to them? Not what is better to the planner. The planner needs to have human understanding. The planner needs to be a humanist. Because if not, the planner is essentially being an imperialist. And that essentially undermines any success that the rehousing, replanning of environments will have. Fundamentally undermines it. We know that planning works in that sense best when you have authoritarian regimes, because people are compelled, they're forced to follow regulation. In a sense, planning doesn't work so well in a democracy because people's rights are much more protected. People's voices need to be heard. That's again the big thing. Okay, and again, Dr. Abacado says there's a question about, did early planners in the Philippines, such as Spain and the US, factor economic potentials? Well, again, who were the planners? The planners, it's not planners like we understand planners today. In the Spanish era, it was not at all. There was just a regulation that said, when you go to create a plaza, the plaza needs to point to the 4 directions on the compass. If you're intending to have a population of X amount of size, then the population, the Plaza Mayor needs to be of a certain size. Around the Plaza Mayor needs to be certain houses. Then the land needs to be cut into certain parcels of size. And again, why is that? Because it's easiest to develop and allot land with a sense of equity. Now, by the American era, it's slightly different, because the American era, it's the creation of the Bureau of Public Works takes over. So you have people with a knowledge, particularly the Filipinos, because they were educated on the Pensionados program in the US. So they very much have an awareness of models of planning that were occurring in Europe, in America, which in turn they were taught about what was happening in Europe. So when they come back, they have a much different understanding. You could say a much more modern, professionalized approach to planning. Although what is interesting, what I talked about in the book called American Colonization and the Filipino City Beautiful, was how the Filipinos were able to not manipulate, but translate the American planning model into their own nationalistic way of thinking. So they were able to develop public spaces with monuments, which the Americans thought were great because it was actually taking cities out of Plaza Mayors, was reorientating the morphology of cities visually and spatially. But for them, it was fulfilling this nationalist agenda of trying to, again, create this identity, which was obviously very, very important when you come to, say, 1916 after the Jones Act, which is where the Americans say, essentially decolonization is now beginning. And the process of giving back your country is underway once you show sure and stable government, I think is the quote. But, planning as we know it is always, in a sense, one way or another, a bureaucratic venture. And the Spanish, again, this is the thing about the Spanish. The Spanish are very clear in their law of the Indies, the 144 directives about here, if you want to create a town, this is how you do it. So you don't essentially need to be a planner. You just need to be someone who can read a text, because it puts it down in very clear black and white language. This is what you should do. This is how you should do it. If it's near certain land, or this is how you engage with the natives. I think the actual environmental issues are about 60, somewhere in the region of about 60 of the 144 rulings that the Spanish created. But the idea was it creates a uniform urban environment, whether it's in the Philippine Islands, throughout the archipelago, or the entire Spanish Empire. Towns and cities have a certain kind of familiarity to them. They follow a standardized form, which in a sense is what the Romans did. The Romans were creating cities because it was an emphasis of power. And they would have certain roadways that would meet, and the space would be placed at the 2 most important north, south, east, west roads. And again, it symbolized, imperial authority. Now, that's not to say that the Spanish saw it as imperial authority directly like that, but they did certainly see it in terms of attention of space to Catholic ritual and issues like this, which was why, again, by the 1920s, you find that the Americans were quite happy for Filipino architects and planners to redesign Catholic spaces. One of the things about city planning by the 1920s and 30s, particularly early 1930s, because there's a planning law that was passed at the end of 1928, Act 3462, which nobody in the Philippines writes about, but it basically makes, for the first time, municipalities free and able to practice urban planning with expert help coming from the Bureau of Public Works. Essentially, you get a flurry of plans from people like Juan Arellano, Antonio Toledo in particular. Arellano is very famous as the kind of first modern Filipino architect. But he was putting forward a large number of plans to redesign Spanish plazas essentially to make them into green spaces, to take away the Catholic cross that would physically be in the center of the space, and instead again put things like markers to Jose Rizal, and even in some cases make green areas within them so children could play, people could do sports. Completely redefining the cultural role of urban space and therefore identity. So there's changes that can take place, but the Spanish, in terms of planners, it didn't really exist. That you just simply needed to be someone who could follow. Hence, the church would be the people that would take up the law of the Indies and would create small communities. Danny, I think you probably know this more than I, but I think the law of the Indies was applied to somewhere in the region of about 1,000 to 1,100 places in the Philippine Islands.
Yeah.
I think somewhere in that region, isn't it, of number?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a massive proliferation that took place. But again, there's equally a big proliferation of redesign after 1928 of these spaces. And particularly, again, by the time of the Commonwealth, one of the things that President Quezon was very big on promoting was the notion of urban design, not just in the creation of Quezon City, but again, the improvement of existing towns and cities.
Okay. Thank you for Dr. Ian.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I guess no more questions, insights. Last question. Okay. I guess we thank you everyone for this very engaging session this morning. So in the Philippines, it's night in the US. So thank you on behalf of the organizing committee, the Partido State University, and Dr. Hirona. We thank you, Dr. Ian, for sharing your works with us, and I hope someone from the government could watch this and turn this into something of yeah. So
Well,
also,
I mean, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to do this. Again, I'm very appreciative to you because it's a public holiday. You're giving up your time, and obviously the most important thing for us to remember at the moment is just to be safe and to try and be as happy as we can, and hope that the issue of COVID-19 becomes much more manageable in the future. Because again, it's one of the things, I'm obviously outside of the Philippines, but one of the things that becomes filtered through is the struggles that many people are having at the moment. You know, those people that live in cities on or under the poverty line are really struggling at the moment. So hopefully, you know, their suffering can be eased. The state can step up and really do things to assist them. I know that that's been happening in many of the municipalities, but unfortunately in the Philippines, this is one of the big problems, that standards vary so much from place to place in terms of what governance is, how it's understood, how it's enacted. So consequently, you know, some people are being supported and millions of other people are not. So hopefully we can have an improvement in their circumstance sooner rather than later.
thank you, sir. And also, I would like to thank our panelists and participants. Thank you, Dr. Acabado. Thank you, Sir Danny, Dr. Danny. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Thank you, Vanessa, Ma'am Karen, and Sir Pao. And thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for joining us for this lecture. So
yeah, thank you very much. Good luck for the rest of your series.
I hope we can do more. We will be doing more. Dr. Acabado's contacting a lot of colleagues and to also join on these conversations. So thank you everyone again. So mabalos everyone, and see you on our next lecture next week.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, Danny.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye. Thanks, all.
Sir, salamat po.
Yan. Ay, Ern, salamat. Thank you very much, Ern.